All right, so welcome back to Paleo. Hope everybody is still safe and sound and happy at home and social distancing. So we just got done with the exam, and we're going to keep rolling through exam 3 material here. So we talked about paleoecology, and then we talked about evolutionary paleoecology, so ecology through time. Now we're going to talk about biogeography today. And next time on Monday, we're going to talk about basically biogeography through time. Then we're going to get into biostratigraphy and biostrat methods and applications. So that's the material that we're going to be covering, and it corresponds to chapters 8 through 10 in your textbook, if you're following along in there, which I hope you are, because it's a valuable resource. Before we get into it, so hopefully everybody's staying safe and sound, but the situation is changing rapidly. The university has made these options available to you if your situation reflects that you might need that. So keep that in mind. Okay, let's review. So, which of these curves best represents the changes in diversity through geologic time? So, beginning of geologic time over here, current over here. What direction is the diversity curve? So like A, does diversity gradually increase, or does it gradually decrease? Does it stay roughly the same, or does it generally increase with a bunch of dips and valleys? So think about what you did. If you remember from the Counting Critters lab, this was one of the things that we did. So what do you think? 3, 2, 1. Meh. What do we got? It is D. So overall, through geologic time, the species diversity has increased. So there are a wider variety of genre and species than there ever have before now. Some of that is probably a pull of the recent effect, where we're able to see everything and count everything that's present now, even things that wouldn't be preserved in the fossil record. But this overall trend is probably actually true. Maybe not as true as we see it, but there's the trend here of increasing complexity, increasing diversity with time. So the answer there is D. So why? So why might diversity increase over time? So is it that it's a more stable environment? Is there less competition? Are things exploiting new niches? Or are there just more resources available? So why do you think that diversity is increasing over geologic time? Give you a couple seconds. So thinky, what you think? If you're confused by these questions, these are nice ones to post on the discussion board too. So 3, 2, 1, let's go. So looking at these options, so more stable environment. Over geologic time, the environment has at times been relatively stable and also relatively unstable, and that kind of changes, and there's no real trend there. So the environment just kind of fluctuates. Less competition, I'm not sure that one's true. There's always been like this arms race. Species are always competing with each other. And then more resources available, that may be true to some extent. But having more resources available wouldn't actually result in more diversity, it would result in probably less. So the answer, the best answer here is probably C, exploiting those new niches. So we showed the diagram last time about kind of making the 2D seafloor into a 3D environment where things start moving up into the water column and down into the surface. So they start digging deeper burrows, reaching higher in the water column, generating new niches, exploiting new resources that weren't before, and that kind of increases the room for more different species. So it's exploiting new niches, kind of becoming a little bit more specialized over time. The modern environment is hyper-specialized, which allows us to have this amazing diversity that we have. All right, so let's get into today. So paleobiogeography, let's first talk about what biogeography is. So bio is life, geography is geography. We all took geography, identifying continents, cities, states, state capitals, rivers. Some people probably liked it better than others. But basically, it's the study of geographic distribution of organisms and how they got there. So who's where, and why are they where they are. It's trying to figure out these patterns and explanations for why critters are where they are. And it's very strongly controlled by the environment, or as we talked about before, ecology, which remember is the relationship between organisms and the environment, or vice versa, environment and the organisms. And so this figure here just kind of represents like an early stab at this by Philip Schlater in 1858. And, you know, largely unchanged since then. There's a lot of terms that have changed, and some people have a little bit more, and maybe some may have a little bit less. But in general, we have this kind of like division, these very large scale divisions, mostly based on environment. So let's talk a little bit more about what controls that a bit later. In the early view, though, the early view, and so we talked about, like in evolution and extinction, we talked about this idea of the great chain of being, how there was like the basic, most primitive, all the way up to the most advanced organisms, then to humans, then to like angels, and then up to God at the top, that great chain of being. And then if any chain in the link was broken, the whole thing would fall apart. And so that was one of the big reasons why there was a lot of resistance to the idea of extinction. One of the big resistance to this idea that animals live in different environments is sort of this Noah's Ark, or this center of origin idea, that all animals everywhere kind of radiated outward from this central point. So we all know the story, or most of us know the story anyways. You know, all the animals 2 by 2 onto the ark, and then it rained, what, 40 days, 40 nights? And then the ark eventually landed on Mount Ararat, and from there the animals disembarked and they went to all different corners of the earth. You can see some dragons here. I don't think they made it. I don't know what happened to them, but they didn't make it. But one of the things that's kind of weird about that is it doesn't really explain what we see in the modern world very well, and we'll talk about why in a bit. But this is kind of the dominant idea. That's what kind of people had in mind, that all the animals started at one central location where they originated. It doesn't necessarily have to be the ark, but they started in a central location and they radiated outward from there. And we just kind of assumed that the animals that we saw in Europe were mostly present everywhere. That, okay, cool, well, we know what the animals are in our forest right next door to us. That's probably the same animals that are in the forests everywhere. And this idea that, well, the continents are separated now, how did the animals get across? A couple people proposed that at one point they were connected by like land bridges. And this is kind of, you know, this is before Alfred Wegener and his continental drift theory. So this is kind of the first kind of way of trying to get around that. Like, how did animals get across to these kind of big continental island rafts that we have now? How did they do that? How did they become the same everywhere? So that was the theory. And then we started exploring the world. We branched out a little bit more. So like in the colonial period, you know, 1700s, 1800s, we were all over the globe, and we saw many exotic animals observed in, you know, Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, Australia. We were exploring these new, to us, places. And what was noticed is that tropical regions are much more diverse, and the fauna seemed to vary by geographic region. So this kind of like Eurocentric view that everything on Earth is similar to Europe, all the animals that we see in Europe we'll see everywhere, we started seeing that, well, that's not true. And so there's these old stories of these menageries that is basically the precursors to modern zoos. Obviously, doesn't look like the best habitats there. I always kind of feel bad for animals in modern zoos, despite how amazing the habitats are. I feel much worse for these poor guys in the cages there. But, you know, these people hadn't seen a lion before. They hadn't seen an elephant before. These are like these mythical beasts that they've only maybe heard tales of before. And so that kind of breaks down this idea that, well, everything's the same everywhere. Another thing that was kind of spotted out is that, hey, well, in Australia, all the different niches, so remember niche is like the role or the job that a creature fills, so like a burrowing niche, an ant-eating niche, the mouse niche, climber, glider, cat, wolf. There are placental versions of that. In Australia, though, those niches are filled by marsupials. So if everything did originate from one center, it's kind of weird that all the animals, all the marsupials were like, hey, if you got a pocket, follow me, we're going to Australia. So why would they do that? Obviously, we know now that it's an example of convergent evolution. The ancestor of all these on Australia was a marsupial, and then they evolved to fill these niches in the same way that the ancestor of all these was a mammal, a placental mammal, and they evolved from that common ancestor to fill all these different niches. So the old views kind of started breaking down a little bit. There were some flaws. Everything wasn't quite as simple as we thought. And so how do we start attacking this problem from a like methodical scientific perspective? Well, biogeography is kind of the thing. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Specifically, we're going to talk about ecological biogeography, which is looking at the present day to like very recent distribution of modern extant organisms. So remember, extant is kind of the opposite of extinct. It's living organisms. So ecological biogeography, what we're going to talk about today, is how living organisms got to where they are and why they are where they are and why they stay where they are. So like this is a nice picture here showing the kind of distribution of all the different animals on Earth. A rich, diverse fauna, different continents, different regions with different animals, much different than the early, very Eurocentric view. On Monday, we're going to delve into the other part of this, which is historical biogeography. So that's biogeography through time, and we'll be examining ancient organisms. So like, for example, one of the famous examples here is, this is from Alfred Wegener's Continental Drift. One of the pieces of evidence that he had for it is if you rearrange the continents like puzzles, all of a sudden now these disparate fossils kind of line up. So like, how would you get these land critters or this like freshwater reptile on different continents? Initially, you might have said like, okay, well, it's that land bridge thing. There was a land bridge between South America and Africa all the way across the entire Atlantic. Very unlikely. So again, we're going to talk about this. We're going to be looking at like fossil evidence, paleogeographic evidence to kind of reconstruct these ancient environments. So some divisions. So biogeographic units, they're recognized at a lot of different scales. And again, with a lot of these things that we're dealing with here, where there's like biology, paleontology, a lot of different fields kind of coming together, and also relatively new fields, the terminology varies kind of quite a bit, and it's a little frustrating at times. But so provinces are these large-scale divisions that are mostly controlled by the continental boundaries. So this is very similar to the map that we looked at earlier. These sometimes they're called realms or ecozones. This is the WWF realm. So no, not that WWF. World Wildlife Foundation, Federation? Foundation, I think, yeah. So looking here, there's like, I guess 8 divisions. Only 6 are actually pictured on the map here, but very large scale, generally geographic, one and kind of like bounded by continents. One exception to that is that, Africa is sort of divided by the Sahara, where this is a little bit more Mediterranean, more Eurasian, and then Southern Africa is more like its own distinct thing. And then south of the Himalayas, that's a very large geographic barrier as well. India and Southeast Asia have kind of a distinct fauna all their own from the rest of Asia. But overall, relatively continent-based, geography-based. And there's kind of like, one cool thing, there's kind of like this transition, it's called the Wallace line. where there's the Australian dominated marsupial fauna, and there's the land, the more normal, well, usual placental mammals. There's kind of this, it's called Wallace's line, where there's like this division where certain islands are more dominated by Australian fauna and certain islands are more dominated by the Southeast Asian fauna. And you can actually kind of draw a line where that is. So that's provinces, the large scale. If we want to zoom in a little bit more at a finer scale, there are these subcontinental divisions, which we generally call biomes. And there are a lot of different, somewhat arbitrary division schemes. So obviously this concept of like a biome is a bit like artificial. So there's going to be a lot of different ways of doing it. But what you can see is that a lot of these biome belts are latitudinally driven. So there's kind of these like horizontal bands, but not all of them. So like there's a couple north-south bands here. There's a couple scattered bands in here, a couple kind of stripes in here. So biomes, there are other factors at work. So there's the big continent scale provinces, and then moving into the smaller scale are the biomes. So what is it that controls these things? What is it that makes different regions populated by different organisms? The big controlling factors are temperature and precipitation. So when you think about temperature, temperature is generally a function mostly of latitude. So the closer you are to the equator, the warmer you are. The closer you are to the pole, the colder you are in general. There are some exceptions to that. We'll talk about those in a second. But also your altitude. So altitude at sea level, it's relatively warmer than it is way up on top. So like think about Mount Everest. Mount Everest is always icy and snowy because it's at a tremendously high altitude, 29,000 something feet above sea level. It's also influenced by oceanic circulation. So like, for example, Great Britain is a little bit warmer than it quote unquote should be for its latitude because it's got that warm ocean current off the shore. So it's not just latitude, it also matters with altitude and also oceanic circulation, but largely it's driven by latitude. Precipitation also, so rain, snow, sleet, whatever, water falling from the sky. It's a function of large-scale atmospheric circulation, so large global scale circulation, large climate patterns, but also some more subtle geographic and oceanic effects. So these are just some like biome differentiation schemes. So this is one from Holdridge, 1964. It's kind of like this ternary where he's got latitude over here, altitude over here, and then humidity over here, and it makes this kind of like cool honeycomb. So like, for example, if I'm in a subpolar or an alpine, I'm pretty cold. And if it's super humid, it's called a rain tundra. And if it's super dry, it's called a dry tundra. If I move down to the other end of the spectrum here, where I'm tropical or relatively low elevations, I'm pretty warm. If I'm warm and humid, it's a rainforest. If I am warm and dry, it's a desert. And so this is just a scheme to kind of break these things up. This is relatively objective, but these boundaries are probably a lot more fuzzy than are drawn here. And another way of doing it is this is just a basic binary. So only two variables here, precipitation and temperature. And so if you're low precipitation, low annual temperature, that's a tundra. Get a little bit more precipitation, but still pretty cold, that's boreal forest. And then you get warmer and wetter all the way up to tropical rainforest. Warmer and drier, you're a subtropical desert. So just another way of kind of breaking it up. And again, these boundaries are drawn as kind of hard lines. In nature, those hard lines don't really exist. So it makes these kind of arbitrary classification schemes, you know, we have to try something, right? So we have to try to classify so that we can talk about them and have these categories. But people are always going to be arguing about what we call the categories, how we define the categories, where the boundaries are. And the boundaries are always going to be fuzzy. There's always going to be a little bit of area because we're imposing this like rigid classification scheme on nature, which nature doesn't work that way. It doesn't have to honor our nice, tidy classification schemes, which we've saw was a problem with a lot of these things we've been talking about all semester. So, temperature is controlled by circulation of the oceans. Precipitation is controlled by atmospheric circulation. What controls atmospheric circulation? So let's take a peek. So the atmosphere is always in motion. The air is always moving, and it's redistributing heat across the globe. It's one way that Earth sort of kind of tries to maintain quote unquote homeostasis. If the atmosphere and the oceans weren't moving heat, the equator would get incredibly hot and the poles would get incredibly cold, and it would be very difficult for life as we know it to exist on Earth. It would have to be like very extreme cold-loving and hot-loving organisms with basically nothing in between. So very harsh. So fortunately, now we have an atmosphere. Very early in Earth's history we didn't, so that probably was the case. But now in the present day we have this atmosphere, and it's always in motion. And you probably remember this stuff from your meteorology classes if you've taken them, or earth science all the way back into high school. But basically this is a view of the Earth and the classic 3-cell model. So like here's the equator. At the equator there's the Hadley cell, and then there's the Ferrel cell here, and then the polar cell here. So each hemisphere has 3 models. So kind of like in cross section, again at the equator there's a Hadley cell, Ferrel cell in the subtropics, and then polar cell at the polar regions. I should say temperate, I suppose. So this is a nice simple view, but it's complicated by Earth's rotation, and it's also complicated a little bit by geography. But generally what we see is that where air is converging, coming together, so remember from plate tectonics, convergent collide, divergent divide. So convergent, so like here at the equator, air from the southern hemisphere is moving towards the equator, air from the northern hemisphere is moving towards the equator. Where they come together, they're converging and they lift. So convergence leads to low pressure. Low pressure is light lifting air, and it tends to lead to kind of lousy, cloudy or rainy weather. So low, light, lifting, lousy. Obviously, some tropical weather is actually quite nice, but it's a good mnemonic anyways. Where you have diverging air, so like where this air in the lower latitudes is moving towards the equator, but this is moving away, we have divergence at the surface. And so where we have divergence at the surface, we have heavy sinking air, high pressure, which leads to what I call happy weather. So clear and dry. Obviously, like deserts aren't necessarily the happiest places on Earth, but again, it's just a mnemonic. So high, heavy, happy, low, lifting, lousy, high, heavy, happy. Just the way I remember it. It's kind of stupid, but whatever, it helps me, so ha. So what we get is these kind of belts where at the equator we've got low pressure, lousy weather. At 30 we've got high pressure, happy weather, dry weather. At 60 we've got low, lousy weather. And then at the poles, again, we have high, heavy, happy weather, although the poles are not a very happy place. They're just very dry. They're clear, they're dry. Another thing is remember that Earth rotates. So it's not just as simple as this wind flows north. The Earth is rotating, and our good friend Coriolis tells us that in the northern hemisphere, the winds are bent to the right. So we are in the northern hemisphere. It's the right hemisphere to be in. Kind of a dumb way to remember that as well, but whatever. In the southern hemisphere, things get bent to the left. So this wind in the northern hemisphere is trying to blow north, but it gets deflected off to the right, and that makes the westerly winds, which is what we have here. Most of our weather in New York State comes from the west or the southwest. Now there's short-term exceptions to that, like nor'easters, for example. But in general, our climate system, most of the weather that we encounter is coming from the west or the southwest. If we go a little bit farther south, though air is trying to move towards the equator, and now you have to kind of like reorient yourself. It's going this way, so it hooks off that way. Still turning to the right relative to its direction of flow though. And so here we get kind of easterly winds, sometimes called the trade winds, because these are the winds that European colonists and traders used to come across the ocean to get their goods. And then they would hitch a ride on the westerlies on the way back. So kind of complicated, a little bit more complicated with rotation. And then again, if we go down to the southern hemisphere, these winds are trying to move up, but they get deflected off to the left. And so this is generally what we see. We've got the equatorial doldrums, we've got the horse latitudes, and we've got this polar front. And what results there is kind of these precipitation belts. So again, the equatorial doldrums right at the equator, there's not a lot of horizontal movement of air. There's a lot of vertical movement of air. It's lifting, it's cooling, it's condensing into clouds, and it rains a lot. And so at the equator, at or near the equator, are a lot of Earth's largest rainforests. So the Amazon, the Congo, the Southeast Asian rainforests. So a lot of the rainforests are concentrated along the equator. Moving up to the horse latitudes, allegedly they're called the horse latitudes because there's very little horizontal wind there, and sailing ships would stall out across the oceans, and they would have to eat their horses to survive. At the horse latitudes, we get a lot of very dry regions, so like the Sahara, the Middle Eastern deserts. Gobi Desert's a little bit different. We'll talk about that in a second. And then if you go down to the southern hemisphere, the Australian desert, the Kalahari, and then some of the coastal South American deserts. So again, we see mostly based it's on latitude. There's these bands of wet, lush greenery up here where we have converging air that's lifting, low pressure, lousy weather, and where we have divergent air falling, making high pressure, we have these belts of dry. So there's also like the polar deserts. The Antarctic dry valleys are a good example of, it's I think it's the driest place on Earth. It basically never even snows there. It's the only part of Antarctica that's snow-free. And then if you move up to the north hemisphere, there's a similar thing with very high pressure all the time, very little, if any, precipitation. And it's controlled by these convection cells that we saw on the last slide. A couple exceptions to this are a rain shadow effect. So geography matters. So geographic features can alter these precipitation patterns. And one of the things that we saw was in America, there was an exception there. In South America, there's an exception. So one of the major exceptions to those precipitation belts are these big rain shadow effects. So mountains act as geographic barriers to air currents, or wind, weather. So over here, over the ocean, you've got evaporation. So you have humid air, humid warm air comes onto the continent, and that humid warm air starts rising. It cools, it condenses into clouds, and it rains all the moisture out. And as it moves higher and higher, it cools more and more. Cool air holds less water, and so it becomes, at the top here, it's all rained out. It can't hold water because it's cold now. And now it's dry, and then it comes down the other side of the mountain, and then it expands and it heats up, and you get this dry, warm environment on the other side. And so it's called like orographic precipitation, where it precipitates because there's orographic lift of the air. The air is forced upwards, forced to cool, forced to condense, and forced to rain out. And so we get these kind of like dramatic contrasts from one side of a mountain range to the other. So this is Hawaii. So the Big Island, there is a mountain range here. And what you see is the wind is coming in off the ocean here, coming in off the warm Hawaiian seas that everyone wants to go take a vacation on. Lots of humidity, lots of clouds, and you get lots of rain on this side. So that would represent this part of the diagram. On the other side of the mountain, though, you get this rain shadow. The air has lifted up, it's rained out all its moisture, it comes back down, it expands, it warms, and you get this large expanse of desert. So when we think of Hawaii, we think of like tropical lush forests. Not all of it. There are these very distinct rain shadow effects. Hawaii is very mountainous. These mountains are geographic barriers that prevent rainfall in some of the rain shadow locations. Probably the most exceptional example of this, though, is the Himalayas. So again, India is actively smashing into Asia here, causing this big fold belt. The highest mountains on Earth. So wind comes blowing off of these bays, hits the mountain range, starts lifting, starts raining. The southern peaks of the Himalayas are very, very rainy. When you cross over to the other side, all that moisture is rained out, and you get the dry parts of the Tibetan Plateau, the Gobi Desert, very, very large desert system, very prominent. And again, it's down here, it's more like, this isn't a latitudinal effect. It's not at the 30 degrees where we'd expect it. It's a rain shadow effect. So it's not all latitude, but it's largely latitude. And then the last thing that can affect this is ocean circulation. So ocean waters are also moving around and distributing heat. So if we think about like the atmosphere as like the respiratory system, the oceanic circulation is almost kind of like the circulatory system. Again, redistributing heat around the globe, trying to keep the equator from being too hot, the poles from being too cold. It's Earth's kind of quote unquote homeostasis. Ocean circulation is driven by differences in temperature and differences in salinity. So temperature is, again, largely controlled by latitude, and then salinity is largely controlled by precipitation and evaporation. So a lot of those trends that we saw in the previous diagram affect the ocean salinity, at least at the surface. Basically, it amounts to density differences. So if you cool water, it becomes more dense down to a point, because it actually starts turning over because ice is less dense. But down to a couple degrees, the water gets less dense, or sorry, more dense as you cool. And then if you're adding salt into the water, it gets more dense too, because you're adding something into the water. And so we get these kind of circulations that are called gyres, because they kind of look like gears. So like this is the North Atlantic gyre with the Gulf Stream. If you remember Finding Nemo, that's the big rapid water that the turtles hitched a ride on. Or maybe that was Australia Current. I think that was Australia Current. I think they might have been riding on this one. But anyway, Gulf Stream comes up, warm. It's bringing warm water from the Gulf of Mexico up the East Coast, and it's bringing it just off the coast of Iceland, just off the coast of Great Britain. And this is why these areas are a little bit warmer than they should be for their latitude location. If you kind of come straight across, they're at the same latitude. They're actually a little bit north even of Newfoundland. And the climate is a bit different because they've got this cold Labrador current. But even like, you know, Alaska is not too far different latitudinally than here. But they also have a warm current. But there's these ocean gyres here, these gears that redistribute. Oops, sorry, went the wrong way. So in the north, they turn off to the right and they rotate clockwise. In the south, they turn off to the left and they rotate counterclockwise. And then there's this big gyre around the Antarctic that kind of keeps the Antarctic bottom waters in. But anyway, again, these are relatively simple, but they're also complicated by Earth's rotation, and the continents also get in the way, which makes them a little bit more complicated too. So you have some of these little like subpolar gyres that start breaking off, things like that. So we said that temperature and precipitation are the most important factors, and that's controlled by latitudinal effects, temperature effects. It's controlled by local geography like mountains, rain shadows, and it's controlled by these currents. So we've been talking up to this point about terrestrial environments, and this is paleontology class. We aren't really talking about vertebrates that much. We're talking about mostly invertebrates. Why? Because the fossil record is mostly dominated by marine rocks. Terrestrial rocks are rarely preserved, or much less likely to be preserved. So the rock record is heavily biased towards marine. So what does this look like in the marine environment? So if we look at marine provinces, what we see is that there's a little bit less variability. There's not as many provinces probably, but we see the same kind of thing where it's a combination of temperature and ocean currents. So this map here is sort of broken down into like an Arctic, a European, an Antarctic, and then like a New Zealand here, a bunch of different faunas, Yellow Sea, a bunch of different marine provinces where they have different biomes, different diversities of different faunas. Again, temperature and ocean currents. So looking in detail, this is kind of like the 10,000, 30,000 foot view. Looking in a little bit more detail, Valentine in 1973, he actually created biogeographic provinces for just mollusks. He only looked at mollusks. And he came up with 31 total provinces for the modern oceans. And you can see down here, this is his map, and they're numbered 1 through 31. So like, for example, you know, we would think that, okay, well, the Pacific Ocean is probably relatively homogeneous. Well, just along the west coast of North America, there's these like 5 distinct different zones that he created. Now, if you look in detail, there's a lot of overlap between those zones. And so it's very hard to draw exact hard boundaries. The textbook explains a bunch of different mathematical ways of looking at similarity of faunas in each of those and kind of helping to draw those boundaries. But the big takeaway here is that in the modern, there are 31 provinces that he recognized. But when he looked at ancient communities, there was much lower variability. So he saw only like 2 to 5. Now, again, this is probably at least partially a pull of the recent effect. We're able to go directly observe modern mollusks in situ in their environment, count them all up, make very detailed diversity curves. In ancient communities, it's much harder to do that. Fortunately, we're probably not dealing with like preservation bias here because mollusks are all, you know, relatively hard-shelled, at least the ones he's looking at here. So that's probably not a huge factor, but just the preservation and the number of individuals, it just makes it harder with the inaccuracies, the incompleteness of the fossil record. And then some other workers recognize maybe a little bit more, so maybe they were a little bit more splitting than lumping, but 8 to 18, about half of what we recognize in the modern ocean. So exactly how much fewer it was in the past is kind of debatable, but the directionality is kind of not. There's more variability in the marine provinces today than there were in the past. And again, if we look at the diversity of organisms as a whole, there's just more organisms today than there were in the past. And so kind of not unexpected, but keep that in mind when we're looking at ancient populations. We're probably not thinking that, okay, well, one given ocean is maybe like 4, 5, 6, maybe 10 different provinces. It's probably a little bit more homogeneous than that, or at least we think it is, based on what we see from the fossil record. So what kind of trends can we see in these provinces? Well, there's definitely a latitudinal trend. So in both marine and terrestrial systems, and in both modern and ancient systems, we always see this latitudinal diversity gradient, the LDG. All that means is that we generally see highest diversity in the tropics, and that diversity declines towards the poles. And so like looking at these different butterflies, so looking at this cross-section here in North America and South America, the New World, quote unquote New World, these different swallowtail butterflies, there is 80 some species at the equator, and then that tapers down to only 4 up in the extreme poles. If we look at the Western Old World, so like Europe, Middle East, Africa, we see the same trend. Lots of diversity at the pole or at the equator, and then it kind of tapers off to the poles we have this kind of weird anomaly here. Wonder what that is. Oh yeah, the Sahara, the largest desert on Earth. And then if we go over to the Eastern Old World, so like Eastern Asia, China, Australia, all the Southeast Asian islands, again, we see this very strong trend, lots of diversity here, even more diversity than over here because of probably all the islands kind of isolating things. And then that rapidly tapers off towards the poles. In the Southern Hemisphere, we don't see a lot of diversity, mostly because these are butterflies, and most of that like quadrant, I guess, sextant of the world is water. And Australia, a large portion of Australia is desert, so not a lot of opportunity for butterfly. So one of the big long-standing questions is, why do we see this trend? Why do we see this trend in terrestrial? Why do we see this trend in marine? Why do we see this trend in modern and ancient ecosystems? Why does this trend always pop out at us? Well, there's kind of this debate about whether there's higher speciation rates at the equator. It's like a cradle where species are born more often, or if it's just lower extinction rates at the equator. So like it's a museum where these older species can tend to hang on longer, and so there's just lower extinction rates. So is it higher speciation or is it lower extinction? So thinking about the tropics are older. Remember, glaciers kind of stripped off most of, about down to our latitude, a little bit farther. The top half of the northern hemisphere was basically denuded by these giant ice sheets relatively recently, and the tropics weren't. So the tropics are older, they're more stable, they're more predictable, and there's a lot more resources. So what do you think happens with speciation rates there? So if it's more stable, more predictable, more resources, probably means maybe less competition. What do you think that does to speciation rates? What do you think that does to extinction rates? Which factor here is probably the most important? So these are good questions for the discussion board. I have my personal opinions, but this is still an ongoing debate. So why don't you post your opinions up on the discussion board, and we'll have a discussion. Yeah. So, all right. Another trend that we see is the geographic area trend, and it's observed relationship between the geographic size of a biome and the diversity that it contains. So this MacArthur and Wilson, they noticed that larger islands have more diversity than smaller ones, and so it was kind of this interesting trend. And they came up with this kind of model where diversity is a combination of speciation and immigration, so things coming in to the island, versus extinction and emigration, things going out. So the rate of immigration, if you're close to the mainland, it's a little bit higher. If you're farther from the mainland, it's a little bit lower. And as there are more species on the island already, it kind of drops off. So as some of these niches are already filled, as the number of species goes from 0 to many, the immigration drops off. It's a lot less likely when the island is fuller that something new comes in. What we see on the extinction curve is kind of the opposite. Extinction's low initially, and then as there are more species on the island, extinction rates become higher. And for small islands, the extinction rate is higher than for large islands. It's a lot more likely that everything dies on a small island than it is on a large island. And so we get these two trends and they kind of converge. So like if I'm far from the mainland on a small island, they intersect here with this number of species, a small number of species, smaller anyways, versus if I'm on a large island that's close to the mainland, I have more species, many more species. So they kind of proposed this, and then later one of Wilson's grad students actually tested this. They tented off small islands, and they actually like fumigated the place, and they killed everything on the island. So I'm not sure about the ethics of that experiment, but they did. Probably wouldn't be allowed to do that today. But they basically sterilized the island, And then they watched how species would recover, how species would emigrate in, or immigrate in, I should say. And it kind of backed up their numbers. One modern application of this is that in the Amazon rainforest, we are logging extensively, a lot of palm oil being started up. But one thing that the agreements are is that loggers will leave like a certain percentage of forest behind. But what that ends up with is, so like the purple here is logged forest, the greens and yellows aren't. If logging companies leave just these little tiny islands of forest, percentage-wise, okay, yes, you've preserved some trees, but these little isolated islands have much lower diversity than these large connected forests. And so, yes, some of the environment is preserved, but it's been altered and it's been shrunk, and it just can't support the diversity that it has before. So obviously that leads to extinctions, that leads to species decreasing, it leads to a loss of diversity. We've started doing kind of things like, when we put a road in, that can kind of like break up these environments into smaller and smaller chunks. Again, smaller chunks support lower diversity, so we started building like these animal bridges to kind of let life through, or like think about like salmon ladders past dams or things like that. So that's just trying to kind of get past, try to fight these trends, but just be aware that these trends exist. And that's all I got for today. So moving on to the disclaimer. Next week, we're going to talk about how these trends kind of change through time, like looking at this through the lens of paleontology. So this was mostly like modern biology, essentially. Today, we're going to delve into like the paleontological aspects of it and what we can tell from this about like tectonics and geology. So with that said, it is time to go, and I'm done, and goodbye. Stay safe.